Welcome, everyone. My name is Dina Rollinger. I am a professor of sociology at Florida State University, as well as one of the directors of research for the Institute of Politics. I am pleased to welcome you to our first research seminar of the 2021-2022 academic year. This event is sponsored by the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, as well as, of course, the Institute of Politics. If you're unfamiliar with the IOP at FSU, it promotes engagement and politics by citizens and, of course, by FSU students. Among other programs, the IOP has a fellows program that's aimed at undergraduate students. And what this program does is it provides opportunities for students to interact with one another, faculty, elected officials, and community members, and learn more about public service and civic engagement. And what you're learning about tonight is we also have a grant program. And so last year we were able to fund, several projects that are intended to help us better understand civic engagement, political participation, and public service. And Dr. Amanda Driscoll's and Taylor Chewning's projects and their colleagues are among our grant winners. And so let me just give you a quick overview of how the session will be structured. So our speakers will talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A period. There's a couple ways that you can participate. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A bubble. At any point, you could put a question or comment in that bubble. During the Q&A period, there'll also be a chance for you to raise your hand. You'll see a little hand across the bottom of your screen. If you raise your hand, I will be able to unmute you so that you can ask a question that way as well. So I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Amanda Driscoll is an associate professor and the director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Political Science at Florida State University. Her research and teaching areas include democratic institutions in the US and around the world. She does comparative work. Taylor Chewning is a doctoral student in political science, and she studies public opinion regarding institutions and public policy. Please help me give a warm virtual welcome to our speakers. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. I'm gonna share my screen quick. Okay, is that good? Does that look good? Taylor, give me a thumbs up. All right. All right. Well, welcome. Hello. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you, Dina, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the IOP for having me here today. My name is Amanda Driscoll. I'm an associate professor of political science at Florida State University. And I'm here to present some of the ongoing work that I have with Taylor Chewning, who's a graduate student in the Department of Political Science at Florida State. That is collaborative work with Jay Crabiel and Michael Nelson, who are at West Virginia University and Penn State University, respectively. And so a little bit of background about this project. It dates back to March of 2020. Which in about like the third week of March, second or third week of March, and I was just bidding farewell to the undergraduate students that I was teaching at the time and hoping and wishing them farewell for the spring break. Telling them, I can't wait to hear what you did and have us all, hear what you did when spring break was over. Of course, this was the spring break that never ended. This was before I ever knew what an N95 mask was or had casual conversations about pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Moderna. And when you went to the grocery store, there was no toilet paper and there was no hand sanitizer. And that was what was going on in March of 2020. And at basically the same time, my faculty co-authors and I submitted a grant to the National Science Foundation to support running some public opinion surveys, fielding some public opinion surveys in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, and in Spain to try and understand how it was that this emergent crisis would possibly bolster or challenge public support for governmental institutions and public support for the rule of law. And the reason that we thought that this was an important question to be asking at that time is because with this emergent crisis came unexpected and unprecedented governmental actions. Government actions that would put restrictions on movement, would put restrictions on the freedom of assembly, would sometimes perhaps entail in some contexts controversial, perhaps really invasive approaches to ensuring compliance with these policies, right? Things like cell phone tracking or possibly surveillance in some countries. And this was happening in democracies and autocracies. This was happening here in the United States, but in countries all around the world, while at the same time, all of these governments were passing social spending and historic financial stimulus packages to try and mitigate the financial crisis and the massive economic contraction that the coronavirus pandemic had caused. And so this was a period of time that we kind of jumped into this and said, this is a really crucial period in time to try and understand how is it that the changes and how it is that different types of government policies and interventions are impacting the public, and how is it that the public views these governmental interventions. And here in the United States, the government reaction and government approach to the coronavirus pandemic was really unique historically in a couple of different ways. So the first way is the scope. Typically speaking, when there's an emergency, when there's a crisis in the United States that requires the coordination between the federal government and local governments, it's usually a concentrated, a very localized crisis, a localized emergency, right? A hurricane hits Florida, scrapes up the eastern seaboard, also hitting New Jersey. This elicits responses from the federal government that coordinate with local and state authorities to try and problem solve the crisis area, right? You've got wildfires happening all over the Mountain West and in California. This requires coordination again between the federal government and Californian officials at both the state and the local level. Clearly, the pandemic and the crises, the twin crises that came about in response to the COVID-19 pandemic were really different, right? This environment was totally different and totally new experience, insofar that this is the first time in history of the United States that all 50 states had declared emergencies at the same time. Now, I couldn't find a map from March of 2020 that had the map of emergencies. This was as close as I came. But all 50 states had a simultaneous state of emergency order, as well as, in addition to that, most, if not all of the territories, most, if not all of the autonomous indigenous communities and found in the United States, indigenous nations, and many of the largest cities, as well as many counties and municipalities, all had simultaneous states of emergency. And so this was an emergency and a crisis that was unprecedented in scope. The second thing that was really unique, historically speaking, about the federal government's response to the crisis was that typically in the face of national emergencies, historically speaking, national emergencies often result in the expansion of federal power. If you think about the expansion of the administrative state following the collapse of the financial collapse of 1929, following the Great Depression, right? If you think about your experience when you go to the airport, you have to present identification in a certain way. We've got to take off our shoes. We can't take the certain foods or liquids onto airplanes. All of this is the response and a reflection of, it's one manifestation of a very broadened scope of authority of a national security apparatus that came about in response to the now 20 years ago, the attacks of September 11th. And so those kind of crises typically involve expansion of federal authority. In the case of the pandemic, and in the case of attending to the issues that were brought about by this crisis, the federal government had a different approach. And I'm going to just paraphrase briefly kind of what a conversation between then President Trump and the governors, that basically he said something along the lines of, you know, I've met all of you. You all seem to be bright and capable people. You're going to be calling your own shots. You've got it. We're going to give you broad federal guidelines, a basic framework to work on, but it's going to be up to you to make the decisions for your locality. Okay. And so with this, what we saw with this approach was local flexibility and innovation. This is not to say, it's important to note, this is not to say that the federal government didn't do anything. This was accompanied by an unprecedented federal actions in the areas of an economic stimulus, as well as social spending, as well as the development of vaccines at an unprecedented scale and at a timeline that has never in human history, as far as I know, as far as I understand, has never been accomplished before. So it's not that the federal government was doing nothing, but this was a point in time where there was really an active and broad devolution to state and local governments. And this brought with it disputes between levels of government, often which devolved into partisan disagreements. Some of these partisan disagreements continue to play out in the national news and local news even today, right? As well as a patchwork of approaches to public health and economic management that was brought about by the newly empowered state and local governments. So all of this brought us to the proposal that we submitted to the IOP that allowed us, with the support of the IOP, allowed us to field a nationally representative survey of American adults in February of 2021 that allowed us to ask the question, how well or badly do you think each of the following levels of government is handling this issue of the coronavirus crisis? And so we'll start first with public response, public evaluation to the federal government's response to the coronavirus crisis. And in all of the figures that I'll show you today, the gold represents a negative evaluation of the government response. The garnet represents a positive evaluation. And as you can see here, an absolute majority of the respondents in our survey that had an opinion about this was just under 1,000, reported a negative opinion. About 55% expressed disapproval with the federal government. And when we break this down by partisanship of the respondent, we do find an association between the expressed partisanship of the respondent and President Biden, for example. So, for example, if we look here, Democrats, I think it was about 56% of Democrats expressed support for the federal government response in early February of 2021, as compared to only 40% of Republicans and only 27% of declared independents. Now, again, remember, this was only fielded in February, like the second or third week of February. It was really only about a couple of weeks after President Biden's inauguration. And so this was really pretty early on in the Biden administration. But this squares with, we don't have information from this poll at least, about what it is that Republicans' attitudes were in the fall, but this squares with previous polling from earlier in the pandemic that showed that on the average, Republicans were quite satisfied with President Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic and the federal government response under President Trump. Moving now to attitudes and evaluations of the state government, we see that there's a lot more balance in terms of support or criticism of how it is that state governments were handling the coronavirus pandemic. And again, shifting gears to how this breaks down on a partisan level, we see that there's more of an equalizing here. I think, again, the Democrats were on average still about 55% in favor of how the state governments were handling the coronavirus pandemic. And in this case, it's about 48% of Republicans. The support amongst independents also increases. And so we see a little bit of an equalizing here across partisanship. But in this case, we thought that we might dig in a little bit deeper to see, well, is this about how it is that the public is evaluating their co-partisans? And so what we did with this data, and this was some analysis that Taylor was helping us with, was that what we did was that we coded each respondent based on whether or not they lived in a state that had a co-partisan governor. So here on the left, we show the distribution of responses about state government handling the coronavirus crisis based on whether or not this is Democrats that reside in a state that has a Democratic governor and Republicans that reside in a state that has a Republican governor. And you can see really clearly that the responses are much, much more positive. So this is about 72% of people who live in a state that is governed by their co-partisan had positive evaluations of how it was the state was handling the crisis. I have some additional slides, but what's interesting when you break this down by partisanship, it's the same for both parties. So it's about 72% of Democrats evaluating Democrats or Republicans evaluating Republican co-partisans have favorable things to say. And now, finally, when we step down one more level of governance in attending to the coronavirus crisis to see how it is that the public evaluated local government in this emergency, we see that there's quite a bit of difference between public evaluation of the federal and state as opposed to the local governments. And the pie charts on these are actually, they look like almost mirror images of themselves. So whereas only about 40% had positive, 45% had positive evaluations of the federal government, it's about 61% on average of the public in our survey had positive evaluations of local governments. And this is a trend that holds across party lines. So 61% of Democrats, as well as 61% of Republicans, had a positive evaluation of how it is that their local government had been handling the coronavirus crisis. This is, interestingly enough, also for the independents, self-declared independents in our sample, also reaches the highest percentage of favorable responses, right? About 45% of independents also had positive things to say about their local government handling the coronavirus crisis. And that's up from, I think it was only about 27% of independents had positive evaluations of the federal government in these contexts. So we take this to make a couple of conclusions, really, that we don't find much of a partisan divide regarding support for the local government's handling of COVID-19 crises, twin crises of both public health and economic crises. And the way that we like to describe it, this is to take a famous quote from scholars in local politics, local and state politics, that say that there's no Republican way to pave a street, there's no Democratic way to lay a sewer. The problems that we face in our local communities require solutions, and there's no partisanship, or there's no place for partisanship in finding solutions to our common problems. So thank you so much to the IOP for the support for this research, and thank you so much for coming and listening to our chat this evening. Please, if there's any questions.
All right, thank you so much. That was super interesting. So once again, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand or you can put it in the Q&A bubble. While folks are typing or finding the raise your hand button, I will just announce our next two research seminars for this semester, which are based on funded IOP work. The first is October 5th, and it features Dr. Sarah Scott Shields and Dr. Rachel Fendler from FSU's Department of Art Education, and they'll discuss their project titled Engaged Education, Integrated Art and Civics. And we have another one before our break on November 2nd, and it will feature Dr. Jessica Windorf Mohammed and Dr. Patrick Merrill, and they're from the Department of Communication at Florida State University, and they'll present their research on to mask or not to mask student social media and civic engagement. So we have a couple of questions and or comments. So Marjorie is wondering if you would talk a little bit about how you developed your sample.
Yeah, certainly. And it looks like there's a couple of questions about the sample. So this was a nationally representative sample. So I'd have to look back into the technical details about how this was done. This was a consumer panel, not a voter file, but this was nationally representative sample of public, was administered by YouGov, a reputable polling firm, and survey administration firm. I don't know if that answers the question.
So for folks that don't know the difference between a consumer panel and a voter file, can you just briefly tell us what that might mean for the non-political scientists in the room?
Yeah, so we did not necessarily contact people on the basis of their voter registration, or we didn't necessarily contact only people who we know to have participated in participated in elections by voting in that sense. So this was that we targeted tried to construct the sample such that we could make valid inferences about public opinion as a whole, including people who may or may not participate in elections.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions trying to ask you to tease out some of the explanations for this. So is there a tentative explanation about why local government people are happy with the government performance, and how much of the local effect is just that Democrats live in cities that are governed by Democrats and vice versa, or how much of this is a need for solutions? Yeah,
two great questions. So I think that some of the research that we find here is really consistent with other findings in American politics, that there's something about proximity to your representatives that really that fosters support, and fosters, if not support, at least understanding. I was talking about this with, I think, one of my co-authors, or just one of my friends, about that, and they said that it's like a famous quote that even though people are dissatisfied with Congress, or people are not even dissatisfied, people hate Congress, but they love their member of Congress, right? And that this is a general, I think, a more general trend in terms of public support for institutions versus the institutional actors within them. And I think that might be part of what's going on here, and that the proximity of local leaders and local representatives, I think that might be part of what's at play. And also, I don't know about anyone else's experiences. I'll just talk from my own experience too. But my whole experience in this coronavirus pandemic has brought me much closer to my local authorities, because all of a sudden there were, we all have to keep track of, well, what is going on? What are the local restrictions or regulations about going about our daily lives? And if we go beyond our immediate neighborhood, or we go outside of our city or outside of our county, well, that might change, and it might be a really different environment if we cross state lines, right? And so this has certainly perhaps made us more aware of these distinctions. And so that's, that's just kind of a reflection on that. How much of the local effect is Democrats living in cities that are governed by Democrats and vice versa? Yeah, this was something that we wish we could tease out, but we don't have information specifically on. We have information on where our respondents lived with respect to the states. So we know their state of residence, but we don't know where they lived. So we're not able to connect it in the same way that we could connect it with partisanship of the governor. So we could say, oh, okay, well, if we've got, someone, a Democratic resident living in a city with a Democratic mayor, how does that influence that? How is that connection? Unfortunately, we don't have that information. So we weren't able to go there. But on a local level, it also does stand to reason. I don't think I'm going too far afield that if you have a concentration of voters in a geographic area, and those voters tend to be Democratic, they probably have elected a Democratic mayor or a Republican mayor, for example. We don't have stone cold evidence of that we can get to in the data that we're analyzing with this, but I think that's probably a not too far of a stretch, I don't think.
So Rowan, I hope I'm saying that name correctly, notes that there was a really interesting video on Vox that came out at the beginning of the fall semester last year that during COVID, basically illustrating how different the polarization and the US response to COVID was compared to other nations. From your professional point of view, do you think this was an inevitable, the political polarization around the issue, regardless of who was in office?
Well, it's certainly the case that the United States, and I think there's broad evidence for this, that the United States is politically polarized right now. And when I talk about different sorts of evidence about this, I mean it both in the sense that I think there's evidence from scholars who focus on voting behavior. I think scholars of public opinion have provided evidence about this. I know scholars that look into legislative behavior in Congress have evidence that the United States is quite polarized institutionally speaking between Democrats and Republicans in Congress and in congressional behavior. And so I think that's certainly the case. The polarization question is not one that we have looked at extensively, in the comparative data that we've seen, but I do not think that it has been, well, I can say two things. The frustration, and certainly the frustration that has grown over time, and with coronavirus restrictions, the restrictions on lockdowns, or the restrictions around lockdowns, frustrations with required mask wearing, those kind of things. Just as we've seen frustrations expressed here in the United States, the same kind of frustrations have cropped up elsewhere. So in Germany, there are protests against lockdowns. In Spain, we've seen this, right? So this is not, it's not, that is not unique to the United States. We've found that in other places. What might be unique to the United States, but I think there's additional research that needs to be had into this question, is the extent to which the parties are really this has really kind of become a partisan cleavage. That I'm not so sure. I'm not sure that that's the case. And I mean, part of it also might be, it might have something to do with it because we have a two-party system. For example, I'm kind of watching the German elections right now. German elections are coming up at the end of the month, and simply by virtue of the fact that there might be multiple parties, that it might not seem like such a natural cleavage to be on one side or the other. But I have to look into that.
Yeah. All right, so Julia, can you hear us? You should be able to speak. Yeah, great.
Hi, yeah. Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. And Italy is the same as Germany on the point of multi-party systems. I have a question about the findings on the national level. Do you think that the recency of the election had a stronger effect on the results, in the sense that, sorry, my dog, in the sense of, she was quiet until 30 seconds ago.
She wants to participate.
She wants to participate. Hi, Bella.
Hi, she says hi.
Yeah.
She's very interested in COVID. In the sense of Democrats saying that Biden is doing well because they're looking backwards at what Trump did, more so than evaluating Biden, and the same thing happening for Republicans? Or do you think they're actually evaluating at that time what Biden's response was?
You know, I think that's a great question. I tend to think, and I have data to look into this, but I haven't had a chance to look at this yet. But I tend to think that because it was so early in the Biden administration, I think we have a pretty moderated response. I don't think that it had been, had been really, crystallized yet. And I mean, indeed, the federal government at that time had a new administration at the helm entirely. And so I don't know that that major, I don't know that the public could discern, major shifts or major changes or, major accomplishments that they would credit with one administration or the other. I mean, I think even at that point, vaccines were just getting started to be rolled out, which, I mean, time will tell us really how the public views this and credits this. I mean, on the one hand, this was rolled out under the Biden administration, but would not have been possible had vaccines not been developed under the Trump administration. So, I think that's a good question.
Thank you. Yeah, it also goes to the point of partisanship and being a cleavage, if it's more on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Chris wonders what you think about these independents. Why do they seem to be so consistently dissatisfied?
That is a great question. And yeah, I'm not sure. I know that with the increase in polarization, this has, one of the things that we've seen, at least on the aggregate, is that the increase in polarization has been associated and has yielded an increase in the affiliation of people who will declare themselves independents. In part, at least it is thought, and it's because of just disaffect with the parties and disaffect with both of the national parties. And so it might be that the people, and this is what I would suspect, is that the people who are declaring themselves independent of both of the two major parties are doing so in part because they are really dissatisfied with the two parties that occupy a place in the federal government. And so this represents just a fundamental dissatisfaction with partisan politics and with the polarization.
Yeah. So, sorry. So we have a question and a comment. So they'll go do the comment first. So I wonder, to what extent social distance might explain your findings? Local authorities, or I know you touched on this a bit, are closer to voters. Voters elected the local authorities more directly, and the state government and federal government are further away from voters. So people tend to be more critical. I know you mentioned that before. Do you have anything else that seems wrong?
Yeah, and I think that gets exactly to what the general dynamic is. This general finding that that as people perceive themselves to be closer to government, they tend to be more more positively, positively engaged, or form more positive opinions to government closer to them. So this is consistent with some of that. Whereas the institutions of the federal government seem more remote, and that can also, it's along the same lines of be dissatisfied with Congress as an institution, but you love your member of Congress when they come home and shake your hand and ask you how things are going.
And so here's a great method moment for a teaching moment, I suppose, right? So how do you deal with problems created by differential response rates when to help ensure that your sample is still representative?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And this is one that I'm going to do my best to answer. So for those of you who are to clarify and explain a little bit what this question is about, there is quite a bit of concern, and this is a concern that has come up to the forefront of social science researchers and policy, the policy community and people who are interested in American politics and interested in elections, that the polling that we conduct, the public opinion surveys that we conduct as social scientists should try and make guesses about what might happen in an election, or try and make prescriptions about what it is that the public thinks. We know this, that it's certainly in the last 6, 7, 8 years, maybe 10 years, that we have not been necessarily getting the nationally representative samples that we would hope that we would get. And the two cases of high profile cases of this being examples have been the elections of 2016 as well as 2020, where all of the public opinion polls, for example, from 2016, many of the public opinion polls suggested that Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in and that Trump was not going to win, when in fact Trump very much, President Trump was clearly elected. And similar things happened also in even though the outcome was different, but there was similar things happened in the 2020 election as well, which has caused a lot of consternation in the polling world, among social scientists, amongst people who are trying to understand what it is, who is answering these polls. If they're not answering these polls, why is it that they're not answering these polls? Is this a mistrust of the pollsters? Is this a mistrust of social scientists, people like me who are trying to understand what they're thinking? Why is it that they're unwilling to participate in these national polls? And what is it that we can do to solve that? So that's to kind of clarify the question a little bit. So in this case, the way that we've tried to achieve nationally representative samples is by using quotas to try and basically we have information about in the aggregate level about how, what is the racial composition of the national population, what is the distribution of education in the national population, what is the distribution of population across the major regions, what's the percentage of people who live in an urban environment or a rural environment. And when we're creating a sample, one of the ways that we do that to try and make this be representative, nationally representative, is to make sure that those aggregate numbers, for example, the percentage of people who are urban and rural in our sample match or approximate, match as closely as possible to the sample that we get. So that is how nationally representative samples are kind of created, or they're attempted. You're never going to get anything perfectly. You never get a perfect sample. That's that's impossible. And we do, especially in these results, there is a kind of statistical fix, so to speak, in the analysis that tries to account for instances where the sample does not comport or does not match ideally to the national distribution of the national population. So so the question that was asked is, what is the what did we do to try and ensure or try to mitigate this possible sampling bias? We did the best that we can. One of the polling companies that I've worked with, it was not contracted in this case, but that is taking this very, very seriously, will actually follow up when they ask somebody to complete a survey, and maybe they've completed surveys in the past, but they don't want to anymore. They then interview them to try and be like, well, why not? What's going on, to try and really get to the bottom of this. Why is it that some people don't want to participate in these kind of studies? And that's a really important question to know. So that's a little bit.
Yeah, it sounds like, so is the polling, does YouGov mostly use phone calls? So Ken wants to know, is it phone calls, text messages, snail mail? How do you get your information?
Yeah, great question. So these are internet. These were internet polls, and the company that we contract with, they have their own panel, meaning that they have contacts with people that they have vetted in terms, in the sense that they, know that this is someone who is, of a particular party affiliation, that lives in a particular part of the country, that, has certain demographic characteristics, that has agreed to participate and has agreed to take surveys. And sometimes the surveys that this firm might, sometimes the surveys might ask them, do you like Coke or Pepsi? Or, how many times a week do you go to Starbucks? Or, Chick-fil-A, like any number of things, right? And sometimes they ask them questions like, how do you think your local government has performed in, addressing questions around the coronavirus pandemic? So that's maintained by the survey firm, and that's part of what, when we work with them, that's part of what we're getting. So.
Great, thank you so much. We'll see if there's any other questions. If anyone else wants to raise their hand, just a quick reminder that our next research seminar is scheduled for October 5th at the exact same time, so 6 p.m. with Dr. Sarah Scott Shields and Dr. Rachel Fendler from FSU's Department of Art Education. And they'll be discussing engaged education, integrating arts and civics. So I'm not seeing any other questions. So can you tell us what's next for this project? And Taylor, I'll give you a heads up. I'm going to see what you're working on before we leave as well. So what's the next step, Amanda?
Ooh. Oh, we've got a lot. This project, I was talking with the director of the IOP just a couple of weeks ago about this project. And, this project has a lot of different aspects to it. It's honestly kind of hard to keep track of. I think probably the biggest thing is that we didn't really talk about today, but that we have a really big comparative component to this project. And so I've said that we've gotten some funding to field studies in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Spain. We also have this summer fielded surveys in Germany, Poland, Hungary, and the United States, which really gives us a lot of variance in government responses to the coronavirus pandemic, government and I think reactions to those government responses. There's, in all of the surveys that we've fielded, there's a big experimental component. So So we're trying to get at experimentally some things as well. So there's a lot. We've got a lot of irons in the fire.
All right, well, good. And so Taylor, it's always very exciting when we get to feature graduate students. Can you just tell us what you're working on?
Absolutely. So Amanda and I are working on another project together that's kind of related to this. We are looking comparatively across 4 different countries at the effect of knowledge and awareness on the court, on the effect of support for the executive influence on the court. So whether or not the public would be willing to support attacks on the judicial system. So we're looking at that comparatively across 4 countries, and we are finding that really the context of the country matters. So whether this is a consolidated democracy versus a developing democracy really influences how people judge these questions.
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, thank you again. Thanks both of you so much for giving your time today and talking with us about your project. I'm so glad to learn more and looking forward to your future research. And thanks all of you for joining us this evening. I hope that you will join us again on October 5th. In the meantime, please check back at the IOP Institute of Politics at FSU website to learn about our new exciting and upcoming events, as well as the events on the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy webpage at FSU. We have a lot going on and we hope to see you again. Thank you and good night.